Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. First, I want to congratulate you for getting up early and coming to a 10 o'clock session, which is early for winter break, which is what we're in, and for finding the room. So we're already ahead, alhamdulillah. I want to spend my time talking about two things. The first is I want to talk about how I would recommend we start to think of ourselves and our community. So more of a theoretical framework and a paradigm that I think we have to adopt. And then I hope to talk about both short-term and long-term strategy for our political engagement in our country. And then finally, I just want to mention that if you're interested in any of the research, and I'll make this announcement again at the end, any of the research that I'm going to be sharing with you from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where I direct research, please sign up for our mailing list. And my colleague Mariam is right here. Raise your hand, Mariam. She has a sign-up sheet, or we'll tell you where the sign-up sheet is if you want to add your name to our mailing list. So let me start with overall the paradigm, the way of thinking, how I think we have to shift our mindset in this coming era. I have been traveling all over the country making the case that Islamophobia is a threat to every single American, not just to the 1% who identify as Muslims, but to the 100% who care about this country. My message is the same to Muslims, but with an added element. That if it's true that Islamophobia is a threat to every single American, and if it's true that the toxic climate that is plaguing our community is indeed a threat to every American, then we have to think of ourselves in a different way. Not as isolated victims of an isolated, targeted smear campaign, which is how we usually think of ourselves, and how it's very easy to think of ourselves, and how we're supposed to be thinking of ourselves in the eyes of those smearing us. Bigotry has basically two objectives. The first is to distract you, is to keep you from doing your work, because you have to spend all of your time proving that you are equally human. So it's to distract you. The second goal of bigotry is to isolate you, is to make you feel that you are alone, that you have no allies, and that everyone is against you. So it's not unusual, and it's not hard to believe, and it's not surprising that we are feeling this way in many cases, where we feel isolated, where we feel targeted, alone. But it's actually not the case at all. It is, and I will prove to you it is not the case. Islamophobia is a threat to every single American. In fact, it is a threat to our democracy. And as such, we have to think of ourselves not as simply targeted victims, but as stewards and servant leaders that are being called on by history and by God to lead and guide our country out of a very dangerous and dark period in our history. And it's a very subtle but important distinction. The distinction between feeling like a victim and feeling like someone with the duty to lead, a moral and ethical and social revolution to bring our country out of this dark period, to save America from itself. It means that we have to approach our fellow citizens and our communities in the broader sense from a place of compassion and generosity, not a place of need and deficit. And the difference is very important. If you look at our seerah, if you look at how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with the hardest period of his life, a period of harsh persecution, far, far worse than anything we're experiencing or inshallah will ever experience. He never approached even those pursuing this persecution, let alone others around them. He never approached them from a space of need, from a place of need. He went to Allah he went to Allah from this place of need, from this place of fear, brokenness, seeking approval. That was only for Allah. But for the people, he went to them not from a place of hatred or aggression, but from a place of compassion and generosity. He had something to give them rather than they had something to give him. Do you understand? Do you see the difference in the approach? Because it is so different when your energy, when you're speaking to people, they can tell if you're coming to them seeking their acceptance and approval, and you're emanating this, you could be almost saying the same words, but you're emanating this energy of weakness, deficit, and need, versus emanating the energy of compassion and generosity. You have to approach, and I have to approach our fellow citizens from a place of generosity and compassion. We have been called on to lead a noble cause, to save our country. Because this ailment that we are suffering from, we are only its first victims, but this toxic climate is hurting everyone. So that's the first thing, is the approach, is the way of thinking, the paradigm from which we must operate. A place of generosity, not need. Now, what is really going on in America today? And I'm going to start here to sort of explain some of the background, and then I'm going to move into why I think Islamophobia is indeed a threat to every American, and then end with, I hope, practical strategies. But you have to understand the blueprint so that it becomes clear what we have to do next. With the election of Barack Obama, so Trump's election was actually started, the campaign for Trump didn't start in 2015. It started in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. What commentators were saying when Barack Obama was elected, the first African American president, was, we are losing our country. This is right-wing, sort of right-leaning commentators. People like Bill O'Reilly, even now that we think of them as centrists, they seem reasonable, but at that time they were actually on the right. Rush Limbaugh and others. We are losing our country. We have become outnumbered. What are we going to do about this? It was very scary to them that the country had changed demographically in such a way where an African American president could be elected. I'll give you just one example, Virginia. Virginia is where I was and have lived for 10 years. Virginia is the seat of the Confederacy. It was actually where the capital of the Confederacy was, right? And Virginia had been purely Republican voting for a very, very long time, for decades, and to the point where Democrats wouldn't even campaign there. They wouldn't even bother to waste their time going there. John Kerry in 2004 didn't even bother to go to Virginia because Virginia was a lost cause. It was like Texas, no offense. There's no point. There's no use to going there. When Barack Obama was born, okay, take this in. This is so mind-blowing to me. When Barack Obama was born, the marriage of his parents was illegal. Can you imagine? Illegal in Virginia. Because it was an interracial marriage. You couldn't do it. It was illegal to marry. Black people and white people could not marry legally in Virginia. But for the first time in a very long time, Barack Obama won Virginia. And this freaked people out. Now, why did he win Virginia? Because its demographics had changed. I was in Northern Virginia, and anyone from Northern Virginia will tell you it is a place where there's lots and lots of people of color and lots of progressives. So this shift in our demographics, and the prediction is by 2050, our country will be majority people of color, minority white. Freaked out some members, some portions of our country, a demographic that is afraid of losing its privilege, that is afraid of, quote, losing its country. The election of Trump, in some ways, now it's very complicated, it's not one thing, was basically a tension between two visions of America. A vision of America that defined America as a set of ideas, a concept, that if you buy into this concept, these ideas of freedom, equality, and rule of law, or whatever you want to call it, then you're an American. That's what it means to be an American. And a different definition of America that was about a cultural identity, a religion, Christianity, and a color, white. And that's what it meant to be a, quote, a real American. And these two visions of America have never been reconciled. And they have always been in conflict. There's always been tension between these two visions of America. The idea that Barack Obama was being accused of being, quote, a Muslim was kind of a shorthand or a code, you know, a political code. They call it sometimes a political dog whistle. What it means is you say a word that one group knows what you really mean, and everyone else hears something else. What it meant is he's not of us. He is of the other. Muslim is code for the other, not a real American. Not because they thought he actually prayed to Mecca. Because it was very interesting, he was also in a lot of trouble because of his Christian pastor and what he said. So there was this contradiction. Muslim means he's not a real American. Why is he not a real American? Because he doesn't conform to this other definition of what a real American is. And yet he was elected. So this demographic shift freaked people out. It created this panic. We're losing our country. The other thing that happened is there has been an economic stagnation where people are losing their you know, the white working class, as they call it, are losing their economic standing. Their wages have not gone up, and yet inflation has. And so their buying power, their ability to live, quote, the good life has diminished, and this is creating more angst. But never underestimate this issue of the demographic shift, and this is so important. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been documenting hate groups, and hate groups have gone up by hundreds of percentage points, 300 percentage points in the increase of hate groups after the election of Barack Obama, way before Trump. This is in 2012, 2011, 2009. Hate groups are increasing, and now they are in full force. They are endorsing presidents. So this is 8 years of a buildup of angst, panic, and anger at the perceived loss of privilege. So what did Trump do? Trump is a businessman, right? What do business people do? They find an unmet need in the market, and they create a product for it. That's what good entrepreneurs do. What was the unmet need? A lot of angry people who are anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, who don't have a candidate who is addressing this lust and fear of loss. And he created a product for them called Donald Trump presidential candidate. And that's what we have now. He got elected. So what do we do about that? How do we respond? We have to understand that we are not alone in this. Islamophobia is one fruit on a larger tree that is rooted in this panic, this fear of loss of privilege among some people because of this demographic shift. As such, if we fight it alone, we will lose. If we try to resist it by going straight to the federal level, we will not be effective. If we instead try to, in some way, continue as we have been, and how have we been dealing with our life or with our political engagement? Either by not engaging or by believing falsely that our welfare is in aligning ourselves with power structures, with the establishment, with those that look powerful. And we had this false belief that we would somehow be absorbed, and when I say we, and I want to clarify because I think I'm being overly generous, the immigrants among us. I'm going to be blunt, we thought we could be white, and we can't. It was never going to happen, and now if it's not clear it's not going to happen, I really don't know what to say. So we thought if we could be absorbed into the privileged class, because we were, many of us, very educated, wealthy, had great cars, that somehow this would be our integration into society. So we kept our head down and did what we were told. We tried to be good citizens. And what that meant to us was doing what felt like that belonging. And that meant not standing with the oppressed. And I feel so bad saying this, but many of us, that's what we thought and that's what we did. We wanted to distance ourselves from the downtrodden of our country. We thought we had nothing in common with them. They weren't working hard enough. Perhaps their state was something they had done to themselves. What we need to realize now is that we were totally wrong, and that our natural alliances are with the same folks that are being targeted by these people who are panicking. And when you look empirically at who is being targeted along with us by the same legislators, by the same rhetoric, it's very clear who our allies should be. So when you look at anti-Sharia legislation, I mentioned this last night, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. This is research we've done at ISPU, and I really recommend deeply that you check this out, that you read at least the executive summary on these reports. We looked at a state-by-state analysis of who is proposing anti-Sharia legislation. Anti-Sharia legislation has one stated goal, and I'm not making this up. The person who drafted the template legislation said himself, he's an attorney in New York who used to live in an illegal settlement in Israel. Now he's in New York, alhamdulillah. And he created anti-Sharia legislation for one purpose, not for it to necessarily become law. He's actually indifferent to that. If it becomes law, that's a bonus. He wants people to start to ask, what is Sharia? He wants people to feel afraid of Muslims among them, to create the sense that we are a threat to the American way of life. So he created this nonsensical idea of a state-level ban on Sharia being the law of the country or the law of the state. Like, what are you talking about? But when it does, by chance, get, accepted or implemented into law, like in Oklahoma, for example, it impacts Muslim Americans and their religious freedom. Suddenly, your will is no longer something you can use in court. Your custody agreement, if it has any reference to Islam, is no longer applicable in court, while a Jew or a Christian or anyone else who has a document based on their religious principles is able to use that document in court and have it recognized. So it targets Muslims and restricts their religious freedom. It is a discriminatory law. Now, when you look at who is proposing anti-Sharia legislation, and then you ask, what else are they proposing? You find something very interesting. 80% of them are proposing laws that restrict the rights of other minorities, that restrict the rights of African American and Latino Americans from voting in the form of very interesting voter ID laws that suppress the vote of poor people and mostly people of color. Also, and then there's lots of different areas where the same people are also restricting the rights of other minorities. But the two groups, the two areas where there's the most overlap is with voter suppression and with labor. And when you think about labor, the rights of workers and voter suppression laws, they're essentially disenfranchising people, taking away people's power. So our natural allies are those who are equally impacted by the same toxic political climate. Our natural allies are not trying to become a part of the oppression, a part of the same system that is attacking us and people who share our concerns. So we have to start to think of ourselves as a community that must resist, not cooperate with the status quo. And this is scary and it's unnatural for many of us. But if this past election and the appointments that have followed do not wake us up to this reality, I just don't know what will. So strategy, what should we do? First, we have to establish our principles. At ISPU, we did a number of stakeholder interviews. We did this big research project on American Muslim priorities for the coming era. This is even before the election. We had no idea what was going to happen. But we uncovered a number of principles that our thought leaders, our activists, our scholars identified. That as American Muslims, when we approach political engagement, these should be our principles. The first is diversity. We have to understand that we are not homogeneous. We are not all one group. And so we have to accept and embrace this diversity. Diversity has to be something we both recognize and leverage. Because of this diversity, it is very difficult in many cases to come up with specific policies that everyone's going to agree on. And that's why we went from policies to principles. The first one being the recognition of this diversity. American Muslims are the most ethnically diverse religious community in America. We are already what America will look like in 2050, which is we are a majority. We have no majority. There is no majority race, which is exactly what America will look like in the future. No one race will be the majority. We have about equal portions, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Arab Americans. We have Latino Muslims, we have Native American Muslims, we have people from every background, but no one group makes up the majority, and we are unique in that as an American faith. So diversity. The second being to balance and to embrace both the local and the global. About 20 years ago, we were entirely focused on foreign policy. Then there was a bit of a shift where we wanted to distance ourselves from foreign policy completely. Nobody was allowed to say the word Palestine. We have to come to a balance. We are Americans and we have to care about the welfare of our country. We have to lead our country out of this difficult period. But as Americans, our country has a foreign policy, in case anyone missed it. We play a very impactful, try to be as objective or at least neutral as I can, I'll say impactful role in the world. Mostly in a very destructive way, unfortunately. So how can we, as Americans, not care about our country's foreign policy? It doesn't make sense. It is a lack of balance. We need to care about both local and global issues. That is what we are called on by our faith. We should have the third principle is about aligning ourselves with priorities, not partisanship. Those we interviewed said we can be Democrats or Republicans. You know, the plurality of American Muslims identify as Democrat, although not the majority. A minority of us identify as Republicans, and then we have a very large portion of our community that says they're independents, and that's fine. All of that is okay. We should not align ourselves, forever. We shouldn't marry ourselves to one party, but we should align ourselves with priorities of justice, freedom, and equality. If that happens to be the Democratic Party, then we should work with them. If it happens to be another party, we should work with them. Not partisanship, but priorities should motivate where we go. And then the fourth is stewardship. And what we mean by that is this. As Muslims, we are called on to be shepherds. We are all leaders in our own way. We have a responsibility to take care of our area, our circle of influence. And that means that when we see ourselves in this light, an injustice against any people should be our concern. An injustice against our planet should be our concern. This idea of seeing ourselves as a Khalifa on earth, this idea of stewardship as the driving force for our political engagement. Now, on the ground, what does this mean? According to all our research, what we need to do is start building from the ground up. Too many of us think that politics means engaging the White House or going straight to the federal level, and that's actually not the case at all. If you do a fundraiser in your home, and many Muslims do, for a political candidate, say Hillary Clinton. There are many Muslims raising money for Hillary when she was, in this last election, and say they raised $50,000, which is a lot of money in a fundraiser. That's a drop in a vast ocean in terms of what she's raising. It doesn't really do a lot. But if you have a fundraiser in your home and you contribute to a political candidate that is local, that is your congressman or woman, that is your senator, that is your state senator, and you raise $10,000, that's a ton of money. And that's actually a much better investment because then you have actual impact. You know, I was once in a meeting, and I tell this story all the time because I think it's so important. And I was meeting with someone who works in the White House. He was a staffer. And he told me something very interesting. He said, your community, Muslims, are the only ones who come to a meeting without an agenda. And it was not a compliment at all. You have no agenda. You don't ask for anything. You write the big checks and then you come to the meeting and all you want is a photo op. So not only should we contribute to political candidates, and we definitely should, but we should actually have something to ask them for. That's just how it works. The idea that that's bad or unethical or whatever is completely insane and ridiculous. That's just how politics works. What I really learned in my time, the past 8 years, engaging with the Obama administration is this. We get lots and lots of access. And a lot of times we get it for good reason. You know, people do get access if they've contributed to a candidate or they've campaigned for them or if they've worked with them, and we should do that. I am encouraging that a lot. The problem is we get the access, but we don't have influence. We don't have influence for two reasons. Because we don't have an agenda, we don't come in with specific asks. We want you to vote for this and against this. This is what everyone else does. So we don't have asks, and we don't have organization. Our leaders come into this meeting, and we aren't backed by anything. We are just coming as individuals. We have not taken the time to organize on the ground, mobilize allies, create coalitions, so that we are coming and we're saying we are representing a coalition of X number, 20 million Americans, and we are asking you for this. That's how you have influence. Access plus organization, and we're missing the organization. And now we've also had the access taken away. That could be a blessing, because it might give us more time to do the organization. And I believe, and I feel very strongly about this, that we should not attempt to engage with this administration, because the Obama administration, even without our influence, even without our organization, they would listen. And sometimes they would be swayed. On the really important things, they wouldn't. They didn't really change anything. And a lot of the terrible policies from the Bush years continued through Obama, unfortunately. So we didn't change anything fundamental by our engagement, but we did change small things, and I'm not discounting any of that hard work. This administration is definitely not even going to do that. So it's a waste of our energy, in my humble opinion, to engage without doing the hard work of first building the social and political capital on the ground by recognizing our natural allies, building coalitions, and building from the ground up by working on local, state, and city politics. Thank you.
One question. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific. So much of the Muslim image in America is based on things that are happening overseas and not necessarily in our own communities. So how do we work to resolve and correct the image of Muslims in America when so much of it is based off things and people that aren't in America?
Stories are the best thing to do. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. This is a great question. I'm going to be as succinct as I can be. First of all, one thing you need to know is this. Anti-Muslim sentiment goes up and down with elections, not with terrorist attacks. Okay? Anti-Muslim sentiment on the public level, on the popular level, when you look at the American public and what they think about Islam, specifically I looked at the question of connecting Islam with violence. When Americans connect Islam with violence is not after a terrorist attack. It's after or during presidential campaigns. Okay? So when you look at what is actually driving spikes in Islamophobia, spikes in the perception that Muslims are, or Islam is a violent religion, it's that political leaders are saying that. More than even domestic terrorist attacks. So the Boston bombing had no increase in the perception that Islam was connected to violence. There was no change after the Boston bombing. There was no change even after 9/11. In fact, there was a slight improvement. But the 2008 and 2012 elections, there was an increase of 10 points among Republicans. And during the run-up to the Iraq War, no new terrorist attacks, no new violence overseas, but there was an increase among both Republicans and Democrats in the perception that Islam was connected to violence. So Islamophobia, and especially this narrative around Islam and violence, is used as a political tool of public manipulation to manufacture consent for a disastrous war, or to drum up votes specifically for the Republican Party. And these are just empirical facts. You can read an article that I wrote about it in the Islamic Monthly. It's called Islamophobia is Made Up. And I use that title on purpose it's like a double meaning, because the right thinks it's actually not true that there's even Islamophobia. My point is it's manufactured. So what can we do? We have to actually challenge and raise awareness about where Islamophobia is coming from. We have to raise awareness about the fact that there's a $200 million Islamophobia industry. There's an industry that is manufacturing hate against Muslims. The idea that it's bad Muslims doing bad things that create Islamophobia is a myth. Believe it or not. Islamophobia exists, yes. Bad Muslims do bad things, and that does not help, and it's actually very bad for Islamophobia, and it is used by Islamophobes. But that's the raw material. There has to be an industry that creates the hate. Islamophobia exists, yes, because there's extremism and violence and terrible things done in the name of Islam overseas, but to think that that's the only problem would be to miss the big picture and actually the main issue, which is that there's an Islamophobic industry, there is a biased media, 90% of coverage of Islam and Muslims is negative, and there are political motivations and manipulation. So we have to raise awareness about where Islamophobia actually comes from and then challenge it. We are the consumers of media. We have to challenge these portrayals. We are living in a democratic society. We have to challenge these narratives, and then we have to raise public awareness about the industry and where it's coming from and how it's hurting every single American. Because if you have an industry that is churning out hate and fear and manipulating people to vote in a certain way, then that's a danger to our freedom, because fear kills freedom. And the more we can raise awareness at the public level about the danger of this hate, fear-based rhetoric as a climate that is killing freedom, the more we can save our country and guide it out of this terrible period of our history.
We're running short on time, so we're just going to end with this last question, inshallah. How do we talk about the sense of self-determination and responsibility for your own community while also maintaining a sense of solidarity and coalitions within your community at the same time?
Okay, so this is an excellent question. The first thing I would say is that we have to move from, again, from partisanship to priorities. We have to take our motivation up one level from specific issues to what principles are we fighting for. And if it's the principles of justice, then it becomes very clear. We are fighting against the unfair targeting of Muslims because it's unjust, and we are also fighting against the shooting of black people in the streets by police because it's unjust. And it becomes very consistent and very, very clear if we can move our thinking from specific issues addressed to our community and what is behind them, which is this injustice, which is institutionalized racism. If we can say we are a community that wants to dismantle institutionalized racism, then it becomes very easy where our coalition building can be, and where we're both fighting on for the issues that impact us directly and those that are other manifestations of the exact same problem.